Like it? All right. Now we can start. Where are we going? That's 40 days, isn't it? For what? Seriously? That would be 40 days from the. Yeah. Next Thursday we're gonna watch Simpsons. They have a Rapture episode. Oh, there's like 30 some things that they predicted so far that have come to pass. Yep. About 9/11. Oh. He said May 19th, which is 40 days from the eclipse. Our clones, all of our clones will go. Yeah, you got one. Oh, we were going through the parables, weren't we? We could do that again. Go ahead. Micah? Yeah, we could do that. Book of Micah. All right, so Micah historically is a pre-exile book. It was written around 720, sometime between 720 and 680. So all the prophets will we put into three categories. It's either pre-exile, exilic, or post-exilic. And that the exile is talking about the 70 years that we've been talking about so long recently when Israel was in Babylon, which started around 606 and 536 was when they came out. So this book was written prior to the exile. There's only two books written during the exile, Daniel and Ezekiel, I believe, were the two. Every other one falls either before or after. So, as we talked about last week a little bit, just dealing with the prophets in general, these prophets are all prophesying about. I think that might still be on the back here. Here we go. They're all prophesying about mainly about three particular events or time periods. One is the tribulation, the 7 years. Another one's the second advent, and another one's the millennial reign of Christ. Prophetically. So, obviously, historically, all the prophets are dealing with Israel. Isaiah being the first, not the first prophet written, but the first one in the line of the way the Bible lays them out. They're dealing with Israel's mess that they have gotten themselves into because they have fallen from God. The prophets are the last final warning call for Israel. Remember, he gave them the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He gave them the judges. He gave them the kings, and then finally he gives them the prophets. Now the prophets and the kings run concurrent at the end of the kings and beginning of the prophets. But eventually it leads way to the prophets, and that's they're like the preachers. If you wanted to try to run the parallel, because we know the Old Testament parallels the New Testament, the prophets are the preachers. Our job in the New Testament church, as Christians is to preach the Word of God and to share the gospel. Now, the closer we get to the rapture, the more our message changes. Our message now is judgment's coming. You better figure it out because the end is near. Well, you start to see that come along in some of these. I mean, God even tells, I think Sunday we looked at a couple verses out of Jeremiah, and those verses, God specifically tells Jeremiah to tell the people that this is basically their last call. They better figure it out to get it right, or God's going to come in and he's going to wipe them out. And that's kind of where we are in the church age. So they run parallel there. But Micah here, he basically deals with Israel's fornication with Samaria. That's kind of the main gist of what Micah's writing about. The book before Jonah, obviously, most everybody knows what Jonah is about, especially in light of the rapture or the eclipse. He was to go preach to Nineveh. Micah, he's preaching to Israel about the fornication they've gotten into with Samaria. And the fact that they brought in all we'll just look at verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Micah, the Morasthite, in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now see, there's the kings that are alive during the prophecy of Micah. Kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. So right off the bat, he's telling you right where he's pinpointing his message. Now remember, when Jesus Christ came in Matthew chapter 10, what did he tell? He tell the apostles when he was calling them out in Matthew chapter 10. He said, "Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Go not unto who? The Samaritans was the first one he mentioned, and then the Gentiles." Now the Samaritan people were half Jewish, half Gentile. So they were not only caught up in not doing Judaism right, but they also were bringing in all the filth from the Gentile world. They were a mess, and God said you can't have anything to do with them because the Gentiles were unclean people in the Old Testament according to the law. So because they had Gentile blood in them, they weren't able to take part in anything that they were doing. And yet you find the Samaritans and those out of Jerusalem were tied together, and that's why God had to approach them through the prophecy of Micah. So that's basically what most of the book is dealing with. It's just going through different aspects of their problems. It's 7 chapters long, and see if I could give you some highlights out of. Yep. Okay, chapter 3, verse 3. Who also eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them? They break their bones and chop them in pieces, as for the pot and as flesh within the cauldron. This is what you call cannibalism. Yeah, yeah. And that goes all the way back to the beginning of time. The word cannibal comes from Cana, the Canaanites. And that goes all the way back to the book of Exodus and Leviticus. And God actually had to institute it in his law to the nation of Israel that they weren't able to eat flesh with the lifeblood in it. Go back to Leviticus chapter 17, I think it is. It comes out of, is it the Canaanites or I don't think it's Cain. It's the land of Canaan, not Cain the descendant, which is two different things. The land of Canaan was the promised land that God gave Abraham. So Abraham in the Ur of Chaldees is over here. When he gives the land to Abraham, it's this land here. And specifically when the nation of Israel comes out of Egypt and they cross the Jordan, the land of Canaan is the promised land. And that's spelled Canaan versus Cain, which is Cain, I believe Ian. Canaan versus Canaan. It's two different, they're both evil, but it's two different nations. cannibalism comes out of Canaan. And that's where God was preparing Israel before they went into the land, that they wouldn't be able to partake in anything of that nature. Let's see, Leviticus, 17. I think they came from Ham. Isn't that? Yeah. Yeah, cursed be Canaan. Yeah. Ham's son, who received the first, well, not the first curse, but the curse after the flood, the first curse after the flood. Yep. So, what did you say? Yeah, I was going to pick it up in verse 10. It says, "And whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you." By the way, we had I think it might have been you, Gina, maybe last week, was asking about, or was talking about your family and talking about people that aren't God's chosen people and how do they go to heaven. Well, this is one of the verses, even in the Old Testament, where God had more of a direct relationship with people in one nation rather than the church. Look what, yeah, that's in First John. Um, Whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, okay, that's a full-blooded Jew, or of the strangers that sojourn among you. And that goes all the way back to Exodus chapter 12. He talks about the strangers that sojourn among you. Those are people who are Gentiles who have chosen to come and follow God as their God and make Judaism their faith. So they're strangers, but they have proselyted over. So there was a way in the Old Testament that you could have a relationship with Jesus Christ even if you weren't Jewish. So just throwing that in there. It says, "That eateth any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. And I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. Therefore I said unto you, unto the children of Israel, no soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger that sojourneth among you eat blood." What does verse 15 say, Taylor? Oh, it's just kind of more on the, yeah. So, he tells you why, one of the reasons why blood is forbidden, specifically in the Old Testament law, that eventually carries over into the church, because blood in the Bible is set aside for an atonement. I've had people ask me before, or make statements, they don't really ask, but not understand why God accepted Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's sacrifice. It had to do with one thing. Anybody know what it was? Blood. Abel brought a lamb out of the flock that had no blemish and sacrificed that lamb. Cain brought a turnip. I don't know. Maybe that's where they got the saying, you can't, what is it? Can't get blood out of a turnip. Well, yeah, that was part of it too. Right. Because God gave him a chance to make it right, and he refused. But the initial problem was why God didn't accept the sacrifices, because God was looking for blood. You got to have a blood to make atonement for your sin. And Abel didn't. Abel did that. Cain didn't. Both knowing that that's what God needed. And the way you know that is because when Adam and Eve sinned, they ran and made clothes out of the earth. Ah, where did Cain get his sacrifice? Out of the earth. Where did God make their clothes from? He shed the innocent blood of an animal. So God needed blood to make atonement for the sin of Adam and Eve and make covering for them. Jesus Christ is our atoning sacrifice who makes a covering for us. So that goes all the way back. Now, here's another reason why blood is forbidden in the Bible. Is because Adam and Eve ate a grape. And we know that in the Bible, grape juice is likened to wine. It's called new wine. And wine and blood in your Bible, wine is a picture of blood. So blood's forbidden here, and that's why wine is forbidden over here. Deuteronomy chapter 32 and 33, amongst other places. So it all ties together, and it goes from the garden all the way to the new heaven and the new earth. That's why Jesus Christ says to the apostles at the Last Supper, I will no more drink this wine with you until I drink it new with my Father in heaven. Jesus Christ is holding out to get the pure blood of the grape, not from the earth, but from the heavenly realm that will be in the cups at the marriage supper of the Lamb that you and I will sip out of when we marry Christ as our bridegroom. So that blood thing, I mean, we could spend weeks breaking that whole thing down from beginning to end. It is so thick all the way through the Bible. It's interestingly enough too, the first sin that shows up on earth anyway is rebellion with the grape. The first sin that shows up after the flood, a man gets drunk. Now, interestingly enough also, that with Adam and Eve, what comes along with taking the forbidden fruit with Eve and the serpent? Yeah. Adultery, fornication. You go to Noah, he gets drunk in a vineyard, and what happens? He has an incestual relationship with his son. And then you go on to Lot. What do his daughters do to him? They get him drunk. They have an incestual relationship with him. I mean, you just find the patterns in the Bible, and then you figure out why life is the way it is and how society runs. It's not that hard to figure out. So yeah, that's a good study on that. But yeah, that's pure on cannibalism that is all the way through the Scripture. And Leviticus, where you at? Oh, read that. Oh yeah, there you go. Boom. Yep. And the priest puts it in the mouth for him. That might be a good one for your conversation. I'm assuming that's at work, Jonathan. Yeah. I figure that's that friend of yours that at work that you that friend at work you got that you guys go head to head a lot with. Oh, good. Yes, fresh flesh, huh? Bringing them in. Yeah. Good. Perfect. Why are you worried about being in a plane accident? That's what I'm saying. He must be subconsciously a little nervous about your flight. Air disasters. You might you might take a beach ball in case you do get stranded. You'll have somebody to talk to. Or a volleyball. Was it a volleyball? Soccer ball? One of the two.
One more question, and Micah.
Please.
So in chapter 4, they're talking about the last days have come and house of the Lord and the established upon the mountains.
Yes.
And then they said in verse 3 that basically every weapon will turn into a plowshare.
Yes.
And it seems like there's like nothing bad. And then 4, that every man sits under the vine and under the fig tree. And that should make them afraid that God will so. And then 5, I don't understand. It says all people will walk, everyone in the name of his God. So it's like the people are there, but they can't get to the mouth. And what is that really?
Well, first of all, in verse 3, And he shall judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. That's Isaiah chapter 1, which will put you right where, is that 1? 2? Oh, yeah, there it is. 2, 4. That's Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, which is details on the second advent of Jesus Christ. So what's going to happen, and he lays that out in that chapter in Isaiah. But every war that we see and study, and every war that's coming prior to the war, which is the Battle of Armageddon, is just a small microcosm picture of what's coming. And, you know, a country wins a war and they think they've defeated evil and this and no. That's just a snapshot of what's really going to take place. Because the true war on earth is going to take place at the second advent of Jesus Christ. And that war is going to prepare this earth for the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. And you will find valuable information on that war all through these prophets. You'll find out who the Gentile nations are that will be there. You'll find out exactly where they will be. You'll find out the route that Jesus and his soldiers, which will be us, will take to get there. You'll find out how many dead bodies there are, how long it'll take to bury the dead, how deep the blood is from. I mean, you'll find out more than you can ever imagine in every one through these prophets on that particular war. And it's going to take place in that valley up there just north of Israel. But that war is what's going to prepare this world for Jesus Christ to come back and sit on the throne and reign as king. So what you got at the beginning of chapter 4 is the preparations for the millennium, and then leading on into the millennium. So in verse 4 when it says, "But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts hath spoken it." So that's because Jesus Christ will be sitting on the throne, and it'll be perfect peace on earth. There will be no fear anymore. There'll be no evil. There'll be no demonic work, because Satan is bound for 1,000 years during that particular time. And Jesus, along with us as Christ's bride and servants, will be helping him keep peace on the earth. So it says then in verse 5, "For all people will walk every one in the name of his God, and we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever." In that day, that's a second advent, on into the millennium, "saith the Lord, will I assemble her that halteth, and I will gather her that is driven out, and her that I have afflicted, and I will make her that halted a remnant, and her that was cast off far off a strong nation," that's Israel. "And the Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever." Okay? So in verse 5, what he's talking about is, and he tells you exactly where. I told you, he tells you exactly where he's going to do it. Mount Zion. There's 7 hills or 7 mountains in and surrounding Israel, just like Rome, wouldn't you imagine? Rome has 7 hills, right? Everybody knows about Rome's 7 hills. Nobody knows about Jerusalem's 7 mountains. Well, Rome has 7 hills because Israel has 7 mountains. And the devil always finds ways to replicate God's work. So if God's city has 7 hills or mountains, then the devil picks a place that has 7 hills. But Mount Zion is the center of all of it. And that's where the temple's going to be built. That's where the temple was prior. The Mount of Olives sits directly east of, and I told you on Sunday, maybe we were talking about the Kidron Valley. I can't remember what verse we were reading when we read that, but in between the Mount of Olives and Mount Zion is a little river or creek or stream. And it's called the Kidron Valley. So you have Mount Zion here, and you have Olives here. And if you go and look at the King's Highway, which is the route Jesus is going to take, he's going to come up from Salem-Peter up through Moab and Edom, and he's going to come across the Jordan River, exactly where he was baptized, exactly where the Ark of the Covenant crossed, exactly where Joshua took the nation of Israel into Canaan, and it talks about him skipping across the mountains. Well, that starts out down here in the Sierra Mountain Range. And then he's going to come and skip, and he's going to stop on the top of the Mount of Olives. In between here is the Kidron Valley. And we'll make this a little flat so you can have something on it. Right now, the Dome of the Rock sits here. Dome of the Rock sits on top of that. But they found out that the place that the Dome of the Rock currently sits, that everybody always thought that's where the temple was, they're finding out that the foundation for the temple may have been found off-site, a little over from where that is. So that building actually won't have to be destroyed for the temple to be rebuilt. Which plays into what the world wants, because they think that's going to make peace. You know, they'll be able to have both religions on top of the mountain. They can even keep it split right down the middle like it is now, and they can have one side and one side. But God, when Jesus Christ comes back, he's going to obliterate all of it. It's not going to matter. But in the original time, the temple was on here. The south end of this was the city of David, which is where the temple actually was. And at the south tip of that is where they would throw all the trash. I'm not going to spell this right. Gehenna, or in the Hebrew, it's Hades. And so everybody says, well, that's hell. That's what the new Bibles do. They change hell to Hades, or Gehenna, to make you think that hell is on earth. Because Gehenna and Hades is a physical location on the earth, south of the city of David. This is the trash heap. They would throw all the trash from the city down in there, and it was just a constant raging fire. Hence, hell, everlasting torment and flames. But here's the cool thing about this. The Gihon spring, which came up out of the earth, which they think they may have found, is what brought water to the altar to make their sacrifices with. They would clean the altar after the blood was on that altar from the sacrifice. And there was a little tube that came out of the side of the Mount Zion. And after the sacrifices were made, the blood would run down. They'd bring the water in from the Gihon spring, and they would wash it off, and it would run down into the Kidron Valley. And you know where the Kidron Valley emptied? Right down into Gehenna. So all the blood that was used, the blood and water that was used for those sacrifices for the sins of the people, all ran down to a place the world calls hell. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. You couldn't put this in a movie and say, man, that's really believable. You'd say, oh, that was made up. But Mount of Olives is over here, and this is where Jesus Christ is going to stop. Hopefully he gives us a signal so we don't do like the seven dwarfs, and it'll go boom, 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 boom behind him. Because we're coming on white horses behind him. And he's going to stop, and he's going to look over the city right before he crosses on into Jerusalem and into the city of David. And he destroys the temple that's sitting there. And then he moves on up north into the valley of Megiddo. That is what's going to kick off the Battle of Armageddon, which will kick off the millennium. Jesus, once his feet touch the Mount of Olives, he will not leave this earth again for 1,000 years. Now, during that 1,000 years, if you go to Zechariah chapter 14, which is just a couple books over from Micah, even though the influence to not do evil is here, there's still people who don't want to live by God's law and God's rule. God's law and God's rule will be found in Matthew starting in chapter 5 through chapter 11. Zechariah. It's the millennial gospel in Matthew 5 through 11, which is right before where the parables pick up, because it's that gospel that the nation of Israel rejects that Jesus was trying to bring at the first advent. He would have brought it peaceably the first time, but because they rejected it, now he's going to bring it forcibly. But look at verse 16 in chapter 14 of Zechariah. It says, "And it came to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain." Okay? So even in the millennium, with Jesus Christ seated on the throne on Mount Zion and keeping perfect peace, there will still be people and nations that will not follow the rule of Jesus Christ. God says He won't send rain on them. I don't know how that's going to look. It's a perfect world at that point, as perfect as this old world can get before it's renovated by fire. There'll still be an influence of people who don't want to do God's will. Now, there won't be evil behind it to allow them to do wrong, and then with you and I helping keep peace on earth, they won't be allowed to do wrong until. Go to Revelation chapter 19. But for those that want to do right, they have to go to the temple once a year on the Feast of Tabernacles and offer a sacrifice for their people. If they don't get rain, I guess, for 1,000 years. Yeah, bottle up some of this that we're getting. I told you 19. Go to 20. Revelation chapter 20 is the millennium. How many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 times in Revelation chapter 20 you get the phrase 1,000 years. 1,000 years. 1,000 years. It's the millennium. Revelation 19 is the second advent, which leads into the millennium. But look at verse 7. "And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations." What nations are those? That's the nations in Zechariah chapter 14 he was just talking about. All the nations that are on the earth. He's going to go out to try to deceive them, "which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea." Folks, this Gog and Magog is not the same as Gog and Magog of Ezekiel 38. Or excuse me, 38. This battle here of the Gog and Magog will be a supernatural battle that will be fought with the devil himself, the spirit of the devil versus God the Spirit, but will also entail flesh. It will also entail spiritual bodies as ours and angels, but it will also entail the flesh. It is a universal battle. The battle in Ezekiel 38 is contained to this earth of nations of which we know of. They're listed in there, and we've detailed those out before. It says in verse 9, "And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them." See, this is a universal battle. "And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever." So what happens? The devil is let out. It doesn't specify a time in that passage. I'm sure probably somewhere in the Bible you can find out how long it is. But after the end of the millennium, the devil is let loose for a short time. And he goes out to make one last swoop across the world to bring any nation and any people that still, even after 1,000 years of Jesus Christ sitting on the throne, still don't want to do what's right. He gives them one last chance. Because we understand that from the Bible standpoint, God has to give every man, woman, and child a choice, even in the millennium. And so those in the millennium will have a choice at the end to go with God or get deceived and go with the devil. And as soon as God's done with allowing everybody to make that choice, however long time that is, then He sends fire down from heaven. Do you ever notice, look at the comparison here. Where does it say the devil is? Verse 10. No, verse 9. "And they went where? breadth of the earth. Does that now this story I'm thinking of isn't the breadth of the earth, but think of a story in the Bible where the devil takes somebody up high place to oversee and tries to deceive him. That's right. When the devil's tempting Jesus in the wilderness and he takes him up to the pinnacle of the temple to overlook the city, he says, "Hey, I'll give every one of these people to you if you just follow me." He's doing the same thing here, just on a universal level. He's going to go up there, and one last time, he's going to try to deceive and say, "I'll make all of this yours." And just about the time that he's going to sign and close the deal, God sends fire down from heaven, and it's done. That's it. Notice what happens immediately after that in verse 11. And I saw a great white throne. It's a great white throne judgment. And then in verse 21, it's the new heaven, new earth. And then 22 is eternity future. So what you got in Micah, was it 4:5, 3:5, whatever chapter we were in, is the people in the millennium that still don't want to follow God, and they're going to go after their own God, whatever that may be, and still try to do it their own way, but they still lose in the end. And that's what I'm trying to kind of hit home on here as we go through these prophets and look at different things, is that they all point basically to three events. You're just getting more and more details on the same three events: tribulation, second advent, millennial reign of Jesus Christ. And once you start looking for key words, as I said, like you get that day or the day of the Lord, that's going to tend to follow mainly around the second advent. You start finding things about peace and the Lord returning and things of that nature, you're going to be in the millennium. If you're finding war and bloodshed and destruction and judgment, you're in the tribulation. Cannibalism. Yeah, if you're into that kind of stuff, stick around. There'll be plenty for you. Well, they're starting to find out a lot of things about that, aren't they? Yes, sir. Well, what she talked about specifically in chapter 4. So, chapter 4, verse 3. I'm sorry, yeah, Micah. Chapter 4, verse 3 is the second advent. Okay? So, once the second, and knowing that timeline, that second advent leads directly to the millennium, then you kind of start looking, okay, I'm reading on the second advent. So, if I start finding anything that deals with peace after I read on the second advent, now I know I'm in the millennium. The reason I know I'm at the advent because, well, first of all, if you follow that over to Isaiah, that's what that verse is about. It's about the beginning of the millennium. But you're also dealing with war. Anytime you're dealing with war prophetically in the prophets, you're almost 99% of the time dealing with the second advent, the Battle of Armageddon. Yes, that's at the end. That's what culminates the tribulation. Right before Jesus, well, as Jesus comes back, when he comes back on the mountains and he blows on up through to the north side of that particular region, up into the Valley of Megiddo, that's where the war will take place. Because those nations are going to have Israel surrounded. Israel's going to come marching back out of Salih-Petra, which is the same place where Jesus is going to start, the King's Highway, down in Moab and Edom. And they're going to march on up, and to some degree it looks like, if you look at some different passages in the Bible, they're going to go up right towards the end of the 6th month, because they're going to realize they're going to reinstitute their feasts. Those 3.5 years the nation of Israel is down in Petra, they're going to figure out the tribes through Moses and Elijah, prophets, or the two prophets. They're going to figure out who Jesus Christ really was. They're going to figure out that they need to make an atoning sacrifice to get right with God because of what they did to his son, the Lamb. And then they're going to realize that the only place they can make that true sacrifice is on this mountain. And so, if you go over to, I think it's Hosea, it talks about people going back into the land at the end of the 6th month. Why would they do that? Because on the first day of the 7th month, is the Feast of Trumpets. And the trumpets is all about the regathering of the people. They would go out on the Feast of Trumpets, blow the trumpets, and everybody would begin the process of coming back from wherever they were living, coming closer to the city to prepare themselves for what? This day, the 10th day of the 7th month, which is the Day of Atonement. That's the day they need. That's the day every year in the Old Testament the high priest would have to go in and make an atoning sacrifice for the sins of the nation. That would lead in then to what? The Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. They would literally bring tents and they would camp out in the city for 8 days. They would tabernacle together. In John chapter 1, when it says that Jesus Christ was made flesh and dwelt among us, the word there for dwelling is to tabernacle. That's how we know Jesus Christ was born on the Feast of Tabernacles, not on Christmas. Christmas. You ever looked at that word? Christ, Mass. It's not a Christian holiday, it's a Catholic holiday. So this month is going to be huge for Israel, and if I did my best guess, this is the day they come back into Israel. Somewhere in here would be the day that they try to overtake the Antichrist. To some degree, they try to take back the temple. The Antichrist may get his head wound here. Some people think it's going to happen earlier in the tribulation. I don't know. I see him getting his head wound here and then coming back to life at this particular time. But they're trying to get into the temple for this, to make their sacrifice. How we doing? Probably knock on that door. I didn't know we were ordering pizza. Sweet. You can warm or know that door. He wants pizza. I had him covered. I was going to throw the marker at him if I didn't know what he was doing. um, and then this will be the return of Jesus Christ. The same week he was born, the same week the earth was created, same week the second advent will take place. This will be when the battle of Armageddon. If I had to guess, it would be the 18th day of the 7th month. So I think this is what's going to bring it all together for Israel at the end of the tribulation. The battle of Armageddon will take place somewhere this week, or at least somewhere in here. Yep. They move in and out. Yep. Yep. Like in one verse the next, tribulation, second coming. You go to chapter 5, talks about Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and there's some stuff in here we just don't have a clue what he's talking about. What book is that he starts talking about the red speckled horse and amongst the myrtle trees and I mean, but yeah, and you got to remember too that had they accepted Christ at the first advent, all these prophecies would have come to pass then. So he's right because some of them were starting to come to pass, like 5:2. But then he didn't finish his complete what he came to do the first time, so it had stopped, and now some of them gets pushed off 2,000 years. So does that help a little bit? That's a good question. Lots of Jack. So you're gonna have two different people in the tribulation or in the millennium, physically on earth. You're gonna have nation of Israel, and you're gonna have the Gentiles. Okay. Now we know that the nation of Israel is going to be wiped down to 144,000, for what appears, and the only ones that are going to survive are the 12,000 out of the 12 tribes out of Revelation chapter 7. Okay. But remember that they are the gleanings that get raptured, 1 Corinthians 15, right at the second advent. That's what I was actually getting to earlier was those Gentile nations are going to have those Jews surrounded up there in that valley. Something's going to happen that causes Israel to the Jews when they come back, they're going to flee north and they're going to get caught in that valley. And those enemy nations are going to surround them. And just before they pull out the sword, I don't think there's going to be firearms there. If you read the passages on that war looks like it's going to be horses and chariots and swords. But right before they do that, that's when Jesus Christ comes leaping across the mountains. And then with him, with us behind him, we go around and we completely destroy those people in that valley. And right before that happens, God takes them out, those 144,000 out. And as soon as that battle's done, they get brought back, and those begin the 144,000 to begin to replenish the Jewish nation and populate the Jewish nation back on the earth. Because each tribe will then have 12,000 people to start. So all 12 tribes will be here. And they each get a section of the land as it gets divided, probably back in the way that it was with either with Abraham or with Joshua. They each get a section. Now, you also looked in at the Gentiles. Somehow there's going to be Gentiles that survive through that period of time. Go to Ezekiel chapter 37, I think. We're out. We've been done for 7 years. We're spiritual bodies. We come back with Christ and fight in that battle, but according to Joel chapter 2, we can't be hurt because we're spiritual.
Your salvation sealed because you accepted it.
Yes.
People that have a choice to say, hey, this isn't for me.
Nope. Nope, because once the rapture of the church happens, which is 7 years prior to the Battle of Armageddon, we go up, we get a new body instantly. We're sealed, we're done. We go immediately up to the judgment seat. We get purified from anything that we bring up there that wasn't supposed to be there. We go in to marry Christ at the great white marriage supper of the Lamb, And then as soon as that's over, we come back with Christ and fight the battle of Armageddon with him. We're spiritual beings at that time. We're purified. We're sealed. Everybody that's wanted to follow Jesus Christ is there. We're back to a physical setup now where we're fighting flesh and blood, but we're not flesh and blood anymore. So you're now dealing with Gentiles in the tribulation and Jews in the tribulation, because the Christians have been raptured out. So if you weren't raptured, you weren't a Christian. And now you're stuck here for the tribulation to try to make it through on your own accord. And good luck to you. About the only way. During the tribulation, especially the first 3.5 years, would appear to run normal. There'll be people having children and people living and doing whatever they're doing. And then once the middle of the tribulation hits and the Antichrist turns on the people and implements the mark of the beast, then literally hell is opened, Revelation chapter 9:11, and the bottomless pit's opened. Also stuff comes down from the heavens that are not godly, the unholy things, and this earth turns into literal hell for 3.5 years.
Think about 9/11, like the planes coming down from outer space and that thing hit.
Right? Right? Isn't that interesting that it took place on 9/11, and then 9/11 when the king of the bottomless pits let out? What happened? I'm sorry. Yep. So, in the tribulation, I would assume that it would be back, the way it was in the Old Testament. And the best you're going to get is, even though it's a physical setup, if a child or a baby that's, you're right, not old enough to understand sin, then they would go back to Abraham's bosom as soon as they die and then be brought up to the great white throne judgment and would move through. Yeah. I don't find anywhere in the Bible where a child is. I mean, one of the best places to look at that is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I know it's the chapter on marriage, but you find in there that when one parent is a believer in a marriage, when the children are sanctified. They're not saved, but they're sanctified. So God already puts a hedge of protection on them, even if one parent is a believer. Now, they still have to accept Christ as their Savior someday, and they still would go to heaven if they died under that age of accountability, but at least God's protection is on them. So if you look at it in an Old Testament sense, they're God's people. So therefore, I would think that they would receive God's protection through the Old Testament as well, until they hit to that point. No, babies should all be gone. I don't know. As far as I can tell, it will be weird. And I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something. Uh, they're gonna have to do something. And okay, yeah, we're gonna get into all that tonight. What? Obviously, there's a numerous possibilities, but one possibility is all the babies go. They're gonna have to have something to cover that up. Okay. Um, Another situation you find yourself in is the possibility that any body, not person, but any shell, because you're right, the soul is what ultimately goes. And when the soul goes, this is just a shell. That shell could then be filled immediately, and we would carry on. Our shell would carry on as if nothing ever happened. Nobody would know any different. But our soul would be in heaven. That's your soul. It's not this physical body necessarily. Yes. Their body's already done. Sure he could. Sure he could. Sure. Now here's the other thing. God could just shock the world and take us all and leave everything empty and the world left behind to figure out what in the world happened. Well, that's I don't think that's in the Bible. That's a theory that's been put forth. Right. Because flesh and blood can't do it.
He had an out of body experience, like car crash.
That's called, yeah.
So it was all kind. It's been really weird to understand it. Yada yada. She was doing that. She was up above, saw her friends dying and all this stuff, and she went to up in heaven. Her grandpa's like, "Come with me, because you don't want to go back there. It's gonna be really hard." She wanted to come back to save her family. Yada yada. So I've heard all kinds of versions. But the other day she said, and it was really cool. She said, we were given the opportunity to experience this world in the flesh, because that's what happened in Garden Eden when they made that choice. Because she said, when you go to heaven, you don't have a sense of touch because you don't have any flesh. You're a spiritual being there. So she said, we've got an opportunity to experience this world of the flesh here, and our whole job is to get back to heaven. And I thought that's kind of cool.
Yeah, but be careful on that because that's what the fallen angels were trying to do, was get back to heaven. The sons of God. We were put here for a purpose to carry out the plan God had for our life, whatever that was. It's different for everybody. And whatever we're seeing and experiencing here, not to, but it's a pile of raging dew compared to what we're going to get up there. So nothing down here is an experience. We're just trying to get through carrying out God's plan so we can get home to meet our Savior. And whatever's waiting for us up there is going to just completely obliterate. You don't need food, and you don't need sleep. There's no night. Here's the thing. You're right. You bring up a good point. I know it's getting late, but I don't remember. I think it's in Second Corinthians when he's talking about. I know it's in Second Corinthians 12 when he talks about going to the third heaven. But there's a point where Paul is basically angry that he had to come back. Paul was taken up to the throne of God and was delivered the mystery of the church face to face with God, just like Moses was face to face with God on Mount Sinai in Arabia, same place. And Paul is mad that he has to come back to this earth. Why? Because he saw, to some degree, the glory of heaven. And he didn't want to come back down here. God made him come back and finish it, carry out what he had to do. And that's why he says to live is Christ, but to die is gain. He knew what was waiting for him over there because he saw some of it. Just like John got to see some of it in Revelation chapter 1 and 2 and 4 and 5. So somebody, I'm not discrediting what it, everybody can have their own. I'll stick with the book, but if you've seen that, you don't want nothing to do with this. So just be careful what you get into on what people think they saw, because the devil is the master of illusion. So right. Amen. Right. That's right. And we have three raptures in the Bible. People. We have Enoch, we have Elijah, and we have John. Now, we know John's in the throne room. We don't know if his body is actually still on Patmos or not, but we know Elijah completely disappeared. Elisha stood there and watched him go up in a flame of fire, a chariot of fire, and he was not there anymore. And from all we can tell with Enoch, he was gone too, because the Bible says he was walking with God and then he was not, for God took him. So apparently his body was not visibly seen anymore either. So if you go off those examples, it appears that there will be nothing left. We're gone. Yep. Yeah, that was a little bit different setup. But when he ascended, which is what we will do, his whole body went. Of course, it wasn't flesh and blood at that time, but well,
I wonder, let's say once their body's finished,
it's very possible. Yeah, we'll be able to walk through doors and there you go.
back where it was,
Yep.
on the path that everyone that went all nations would come against me, but shall go. For the future was the King, the Lord of hosts, will keep peace and famine. So during the millennial reign of Christ, we're going to move toward the Lord. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall go into the Lord's of hosts, and all the sacrifices put on the stake of them. See there in that day there should be no more than Canaanite in the house of the Lord. But during the Feast of Tabernacles, the millennial reign of Christ, Palestinians are picked out of the
See ya.
so there will be Gentiles will be there. They don't want to have anything to do with God is a fatty.
Yeah, totally.
They're going to be
And they'll have to worship God.
then at the great white throne, they're going to get cast down with fire.
Because they don't. Yeah, they're going to be people that aren't physically present at the Battle of Armageddon that make it through.
People like that are going to make it.
Yep.
And during
They don't die, they multiply.
Christ's going to go, no, you're Palestinian. You're out. We want your ground.
And that probably drive them more crazy than anything else is they won't be able to refute Christ and do bad. They'll have to do right. So yeah, that's a great point. Right. And they'll have to wait 1,000 years till the devil to get out to try to make one last revolt. They got 2,000 years to pretend they own that land. They're gonna have to spend 1,000 years bowing down at that land. Yep.
doing whatever may happen, even though
Right. Yep.
there's pictures all over the Bible. But, and it says, you know, and people saw it.
Absolutely.
Doing that.
Be a pretty good sight, won't it?